major challenge that world faced. And of course, if I can add vaccination in it, the way the acceptance vaccination was accepted and it was actually administered. I think these are some of the success stories of Pakistan when it comes to COVID-19. But today we are focusing on the fiscal response, the financial policies response in tackling COVID and in way forward. So the macroeconomic model that Sajid would be introducing and that our colleagues from UNESCAP would be introducing. We actually did a couple of things. We tried to do some sort of need assessment of the extent of loss and extent of the government's intervention which were needed. We also look at government's response. This model, it can help us to actually understand what worked and what didn't work in terms of fiscal stimulus and fiscal response. And way forward, which to me today is extremely important when we see at least 3 provinces in, related by the devastating floods. I think it has become more important in terms of KP, South Punjab, Balochistan, and Sindh, now heavily inundated by the floods. And again, one has to see that how this insecurity that was already there in terms of K-shaped recovery from COVID-19, and I'm using the word K-shaped because we found that some of the sectors, they did extremely well, they recovered extremely well, and there were certain sectors which couldn't bounce back as quickly or as efficiently as they should have been. So in that K-shaped recovery, we need to see that what sort of interventions provincial governments and the federal government they can do in order to tackle the challenges posed by floods. But then also in terms of relating it with the report of UNESCAP, which was first launched in April 2022 in Bangkok, and I can resonate the 3 messages that came from the report yesterday and today, so in COVID and in flood. So the first message that came very clear from the report is that fiscal macroeconomic policies saying a human and social phase that will not work. So we need to have macroeconomic stability, macroeconomic policies, fiscal interventions, which can actually contribute towards human development, which can contribute towards the social and human uplifting. So that is the first message which is coming from this report. The second, which again COVID-19 has taught us slightly in a harsh manner, that the countries that don't invest in human development are at the losing end. So the developing countries, even those who were not investing in education and health and social protection, today they have realized the importance of it because it is just like one stitch in time that saves 9 stitches afterwards. So investing in education, investing in health, investing in social protection to build resilience of communities, that is important. The third important message that comes from this report is redistributive policies, and that's where I say that when we're talking of K-shaped recovery, we need to see that who are the people who were left behind, and those who were left behind, how they can actually be mainstreamed, and they can, the bridge between have and have not can be narrowed through these redistributive policies. And the fourth important message that comes from this report is the digital divide, bridging digital divide. So in the era of fourth industrial revolution, in the era of digital economies, while we are talking of all other sort of inequalities, we also need to think of this digital inequality, and we need to see that how that can be made accessible to all, so that no one is left behind. So this was the brief summary. I'm sure my colleagues, they would be then giving you more details. I just want to conclude with the word of thanks SDPI during this COVID-19. We had been working with Ministry of Finance. We had been working with Ministry of Climate Change on green recovery initiatives. We had been working quite closely with the Benazir Income Support Program for social protection, and most importantly, we have been working with the Planning Commission's Sustainable Development Goals Unit, especially Ali Kemal, who is actually the force behind many of these initiatives. So I thanks all these ministries and departments for their continued trust in SDPI, and I thank our parliamentarians, Mehnaz Akbar Sahaba. She was a great support and partner when she was on opposition benches, and she is still a great support while as a parliamentary secretary on treasury benches. And this actually shows that there are certain agenda points where we can have a political consensus, and sustainable development goal, human development, thinking of educating our future generations, providing social protection, and for strengthening health facilities. These are perhaps the minimalistic common agenda points which are there across all political parties and across political spectrum. And organizations like SDPI, we can try to remain as a catalyst, and we can try to catalyze to forge this consensus. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Sir, thank you so much for a very excellent summary covering the work that we have done over the last couple of years with the help of UNESCAP and Federal SDGs Unit and other ministries, and also bringing some key messages coming out of these. I'll just pick on 2 points sort of before inviting our next speaker. The one is the kind of the macro model that has been highlighted by Dr. Suleri Saab. The work with UNESCAP has actually 3 key components the one is producing sort of a research-based the rigorous evidence on the impact of COVID-19 across different sectors. And based on that, sort of suggesting a way forward to align recovery policies, particularly the fiscal policies, with the SDGs agenda of the country. You know, one of the threat that was from sort of the COVID-19 was that its lending impact, the first impact, distorted many of the progress that has been made by on SDGs agenda. Actually, poverty, hunger, employment, inequality, it really distorted, disrupted, and the impact was really inequitable. The countries, the regions, the population groups within countries, those who were already vulnerable, were severely hit by the COVID-19. And the second and most important was that sort of the recovery policies, there are structural barriers again to those who are already vulnerable to access the benefits from those recovery policies. So there is a fear that recovery policies may inflate the existing disparities. So in that context, it was very sort of crucial to bring some evidence for informed policy making, which can bridge those gaps, which can sort of create disparities. In this context, we took 3 key assignments. The one is producing research or evidence, you can call. The second is, based on that, we developed a tailored UNESCAP model, particularly for Pakistan, so that there can be an informed sort of planning at Planning Commission and other ministries to design policies for an effective and efficient investment decisions. This is a structural model of roughly 120 equations based on Pakistan, and you can build scenarios till 2030 to make some informed decision. And the third part is the capacity building of the public sector, particularly to use these tools for their day-to-day decision-making process. And in this regard, we had so far 3 capacity building workshops: Ministry of Finance with SDGs unit and Ministry of Climate Change. And we will also be moving to other departments. And we plan to take this to the provincial level at a disaggregate analysis going forward. One key message that also highlighted by Dr. Suleri Saab, and that is arising, I mean, becoming very strong, that is the investment in people, particularly in the health, education, and the social protection will be critical for an inclusive and resilient recovery from COVID-19. With this, it brings me to the second speaker of today, actually, particularly from the social protection context. We have a video message recorded by Federal Minister of Poverty Alleviation and Social Safety, Benazir Income Support Program, Government of Pakistan. She has been in the Sindh, so she has sent us a recorded message. So please, my MIS team, please.
Assalamu alaikum to all, and thank you for giving me this opportunity. On behalf of the Government of Pakistan, I would like to appreciate the hosts of this policy dialogue, SDPI, SDGs unit, and UNESCAP. I would also like to congratulate UNESCAP for a timely and much needed initiative like the Economic and Social Survey of Asia and Pacific 2022. It is also important to appreciate the work done by SDPI in collaboration with UNESCAP, which specifically identifies policy options for the development of a thorough fiscal policy to support and finance forward-looking, inclusive and green recovery in Pakistan. As you all know that COVID-19 hit the world in the worst possible manner. Moreover, it hit the vulnerable population the most. And today as I speak to you, Pakistan is witnessing yet another crisis. We are facing unprecedented rains that have caused massive flooding in many parts of the country. Balochistan, Sindh, South Punjab, and parts of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa are witnessing catastrophic rains. The scale and magnitude of this devastating rainfall warrants speedy and sustainable relief for all the people affected. More than 830 precious lives have been lost to these devastating rains. There has been massive damage to the lives and livelihoods of people. Today's discussion on inclusive recovery and development, therefore, becomes more important. We need to further ensure that the recovery from COVID-19 is inclusive. I am glad to mention that the main message coming out of this work resonates well with the priority of my ministry, Benazir Income Support Program, and most importantly, with my party, the Pakistan People's Party. I believe and am glad to see the expected results coming out of this work that the provision of efficient social protection lies at the heart of resilience to crisis and supporting sustainable recovery from COVID. Sessions and workshops for public sector, ministries and various departments for more informed policy making. It would be great if UNESCAP and SDPI, in collaboration with our ministry, can provide the same for Benazir Income Support Program in order to further build the capacity. I once again congratulate UNESCAP for taking this survey and collaborating with SDPI to produce much needed evidence-based work to design and implement informed policies for recovery from COVID-19. I look forward to this continued partnership in the coming years as well. For at Benazir Income Support Program, we eagerly look towards fruitful partnerships and working towards evidence-based policy making. I thank you all once again for giving me this opportunity.
Assalamu alaikum to all,
and thank you for giving me this opportunity.
The Honorable Minister for taking time out while very busy schedule. She was able to send us some WhatsApp messages to ensure BISP's participation in this very important discussion. Let me now invite the man of the day, who will be bringing us all this discussion in a more contextual manner, Mr. Zhang Jian. He has all the way traveled from Bangkok to sort of on this policy dialogue. He is economics affair officer at UNESCAP and has expertise in development economics, structural transformation, and public finance. And he was one of the men behind this Asia-Pacific survey and the work that we have been doing with UNESCAP. Over to you, Zhang.
Thank you, Sajid. And I first I would like to thank the Federal SDGs Unit, Ministry of Planning, Development and Special Initiatives, and also the Sustainable Development Policy Institute for jointly hosting this event with ESCAP. So the Economic and Social Survey of Asia and the Pacific, as you may know, is one of the longest continuously running reports in the United Nations system. So it was first launched in 1947 and has been providing macroeconomic analysis and a policy insight since. So in the more recent years, we have converted the launch events of the survey into policy dialogues with government bodies and the leading think tanks in Asia and the Pacific. The purpose is to not only disseminate our key findings and the policy messages of the survey, but more importantly, to solicit policy wisdom and valuable feedbacks, including critical feedbacks on our own research from frontline policymakers and local experts through the interactive discussion. So without further ado, let me dive into this 2022 survey. Next slide, please. Okay, next slide. So first, I would like to give a little bit overall macroeconomic backdrop of the survey 2022's discussion on inclusive development policies. So as already introduced by the previous speakers, inequality concerns came into the global spotlight after the 2008 global financial and economic crisis. So in the developed world, Occupy Wall Street and the debates on the 99% versus the top 1% caught the international attention. And in developing Asia and the Pacific, shared prosperity and leaving no one behind in the drive towards the sustainable development agenda became increasingly a public and policymakers' concern. When fast development is accompanied by substantial widening economic gaps between the rich and the poor in many developing countries of the region. Next slide, please. So ESCAP has been closely following this development in the past years through its various publications. For example, in 2015, we discussed how to make growth more inclusive and sustainable in the survey. In 2017, we had a special book chapter on prospect of progressive tax reforms in Asia and the Pacific. In 2018, the theme study of ESCAP focused on inequality in Asia and the Pacific in the era of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And in 2019, we had a follow-up report on closing the gaps in empowerment and inclusion in Asia and the Pacific. Next slide, please. So naturally, the 2022 survey followed this momentum. And the COVID pandemic, in particular, brought the issue of inclusive development to the very front. So as we saw in the past 2 years, the poor and the vulnerable groups were most severely affected by the pandemic shock and risk being left further behind in the recovery process. So the 2021 survey, that's the previous survey, observed that the vast gaps between the rich and the poor, not only in the exposure to the economic shocks of the COVID, but also in their ability to adapt to the post-COVID world, will matter for the recovery process. So the infographics on this slide shows that the gaps between developed and developing countries in vaccination, in access to public support, in digital connectivity, and in chances to adapt to teleworking are drastically different. And we have data on the comparison between developed and developing countries. We do have a lack of data, like rigorous data on the difference between different income groups within national borders. But I think it's like straightforward to imagine that the same gaps also exist between the rich and the poor, even within country borders. So the 2021 survey argued that countries need to prioritize inclusiveness for robust recovery after COVID. So this will deliver, the focus on inclusiveness will deliver three key benefits. The first is to shorten the pandemic threat for all by ensure that everybody has more equal access to vaccines. And second, it can reduce the risk of post-COVID disruptive social unrest when the poor is taken care of and the inequality gap will not further widen too much during the pandemic. And then thirdly, that the focus on inclusiveness will provide a boost to the recovery in aggregate demand, given that the propensity of consumption is higher for the poor. Next slide, please. So the 2022 survey further highlighted the scarring effect of the COVID. So it noted that the long-term scars may hurt disadvantaged groups, such as informal workers, the women, and the youth further. So these long-lasting scars include disruptions to the labor market, which erode worker skills and reduce their chances to return to the workforce, especially for those in informal employment or vulnerable sectors. Second, the lasting scars also shows in the form of subdued capital investment, which implies that that the future growth will be weaker, and also there may be less employment opportunities. And again, this will hurt the already disadvantaged groups in the society. And the learning deficit is a third and a very important factor in it, which will have long-term consequences on the learning and earning potentials, especially of the poor families already disadvantaged in the educational system. Next slide, please. So this implies that the poverty shock can be more persistent than what we expect. So in this chart, SDPI estimated that by the end of 2021, 85 million people in Asia and the Pacific was pushed back into extreme poverty by the pandemic. So although this estimation is done based on shocks through the per capita income levels or GDP figures, after the pandemic, after the economic recovery, the economies recovered from the pandemic, naturally, through the modeling, the poverty figure, like this new poverty created by the pandemic, will also reduce. However, given some structural factors, the poverty impact of the pandemic may be more persistent than what we expect from the modeling purely based on the income levels. In particular, some of the structural disadvantages of the poor in the transition to the post-pandemic world, as we have seen in the previous slide, may spell additional inequality pressure in the future. Next slide, please. So in this context, a multi-pronged strategy and coordinated government actions would be needed to build forward fairer for the inclusive recovery from the pandemic and for inclusive development in the long term. So survey 2022 explores three key areas on this front. The first is fiscal policies to provide the basic safety net and invest for the poor and also invest in the poor. Second, central banking for inclusive development as a newer idea. And thirdly, structural transformation as a fundamental force in shaping inequality in the process of development. Next slide, please. So first, let's look at the fiscal policies, which is of immediate importance for the inclusive recovery and is at the center of the inclusive development in the longer term. Next slide, please. As we can see, that the deteriorated fiscal indicators and the emergency spending in response to COVID has further squeezed the fiscal space in developing Asia-Pacific countries. The fiscal deficits are also likely to remain significant in the coming years. So this means that a further fiscal expansion to support inclusive recovery and development may not be a viable option for many of the developing countries in the region. And for a few, painful fiscal consolidation may be unavoidable. Next slide, please. However, through our analysis on the past experience suggests that fiscal consolidations can be very harmful. It can both increase inequality levels in the country and also reduce future output at the same time. So UNESCAP estimates that the Gini coefficient could be up by 0.2 percentage points after in the aftermath of fiscal consolidations, and the GDP growth could be down by as much as 4 percentage points. Next slide, please. So in this post-COVID reality, it is therefore very important and crucial to choose and pick public expenditure items that can deliver the most on inclusive development and make sure that each dollar spent generates the greatest impact. So this chart shows that the estimated Gini impact of different spending items in different countries, and in general, education, healthcare, and social security transfers have the greatest inequality reduction effect, as already noticed by Sajid in his remarks. And it's also worth noting that this inequality reduction effect can vary significantly across countries. Next slide, please. So, what are the implications for policy recommendations? First, that we think policy spending can prioritize items with the greatest equalizing impact, especially when they also boost labor productivity in the future. Health care, education, and social expenditure in particular tend to be the first to cart in fiscal consolidations in the past, but they really should not. Next slide, please. At the same time, the government would need to spend smartly and get the bigger bang for the buck for the public expenditure. In doing so, expanding the coverage would be crucial, ensure that nobody is left outside the public welfare system and the investment in the people, and also leverage innovations such as the digital technology for more efficient spending and targeting would be more important in this process. Next slide, please. The revenue mobilization, especially in a progressive manner, should not be left outside either. Some standard policy options are listed here, but actually the tricks are in the actual implementation and also in the details. So as Sajid also mentioned, that we already have a case study on Pakistan in terms of mobilizing fiscal policies to promote inclusive recovery, which I see is also distributed in writing here. So I think people can explore the Pakistan case study for further details. Next slide, please. So central banking also matters for inclusive development. This is a relatively new area, and here we will highlight a few ways on how central banking can support inclusive development. Next slide, please. Can you go to the previous slide? Okay, next. Then next. Okay, I think we have one missing slide here, but it's okay. Let's start from here. Can we go back one slide? So basically, central banks can affect inclusive development. Like to give an example that how monetary policy, for example, matters. So when interest rate is lowered, the borrowers will be better off, but the retirees who depend on interest income will be worse off. And in return, that the inequality status of a country or the level of inequality would also affect the effectiveness of monetary policies. Now, for example, in economies where wealth is highly concentrated, lower interest rates may not boost overall consumer spending because the rich don't simply spend more in response to lower interest rate in this context. And the central banks can try to affect inclusive development through 4 main channels. The first is the monetary policy conduct. Second, official reserve management. Third, currency issuance. And lastly, financial regulation. Next slide, please. So on monetary policy conduct, the priority now is to maintain price stability. We argue that central banks can better communicate the distributional impact to the public and also consider economic inequality when adjusting the policy rate, and also allocate part of the asset purchases to social bonds if necessary and doable. Next slide, please. On the reserve management side, it is common for central banks to prioritize safety and liquidity, but as the reserves are considered more than adequate in many Asia-Pacific developing countries, we argue that reserve management with social gains in mind can be pursued. To do this, central banks can analyze how this shift will affect their portfolio performance, set up an investment committee that comprises external experts to make reserve allocation decisions, and also use part of the excessive reserves to fund local social projects. Next slide, please. On central banks as currency issuers, around half of the central banks in the region are already exploring central bank digital currency, or CBDC. To make CBDC work for financial inclusion, central banks need to consider various actions. For example, they can design CBDC in a way that helps people to rely less on limited banking services. And the central banks also need to work with other policymakers to improve digital and financial literacy. It's also important to note that CBDC comes with certain risks, such as capital flow volatility. So central banks should be mindful of these risks and have mitigation measures in place. Last, as financial regulators, we argue that central banks should not only promote financial stability, but to also ensure the enabling environment for innovative social finance. For example, central banks can develop and or harmonize taxonomies for instruments such as social impact bonds and sustainability-linked bonds. They can also provide some financial assistance to cover the high transaction costs in issuing these bonds. Next slide. Okay, one missing here. So just to sum up on the central bank's role for inclusive development, in essence, although inclusive central banking is a relatively new idea, and there will still be some actions that most, if not all, central banks in the region can do, such as promoting financial access and literacy, and financial literacy is one such example. To make inclusive banking a reality, central banks will need to make some internal changes, such as new legal frameworks for issuing the CBDC, and work closely with government and other financial regulators. But this could be more demanding for many developing countries of the region at the current stage. Next slide. Sorry, can we go back? Okay. So lastly, the survey also talked about the mobilizing structural policies to address the root cause of inequality. Next slide, please. So much of the debate on inequality and inclusive development to date has focused on policies with direct monetary implications on income or wealth distribution, such as progressive taxes or public transfers, this including public welfare and cash handouts. While redistributive measures, which target the symptoms of inequality, are indispensable for achieving inclusive development, they alone won't be adequate to solve the problem. Especially for developing countries, structural policies to address the root cause of inequality, that is, the forces that shape the market distribution in the first place, can matter much more. So as an example, as we can see from this chart, that in advanced countries, taxes and transfers do play an important role in addressing the symptoms of inequality, as indicated by the red columns here in this chart. So that indicates the Gini reduction due to taxes and transfers. Next slide, please. But in developing Asia-Pacific countries, the role of taxes and transfers in reducing Gini coefficient is still highly limited. So due to the narrow fiscal space and the challenges with targeting. So in some cases, taxes and transfers can even have a regressive effect that is increasing rather than reducing inequality in the process. So in other words, how much salaries, that's the market distribution, one gets in the first place, can matter much more than how much government subsidies or cash handouts or welfare transfers one receives, to determine the overall inequality distribution pattern in a country. Next slide, please. So the experience of, can we go back one slide? This, I don't know what's happening here. Yeah, we have another missing slide here. Okay, so let me just try to explain in words. So we also analyzed the time series, like how the reduction or the changes in Gini coefficient moved across time in different countries of Asia-Pacific region. So what we found there was that the experience of Asia-Pacific developing countries between 1990 and 2019, it's a 30-year period, suggests that taxes and transfers didn't become much more effective in reducing inequality over time. And even in advanced countries, although increases in tax and transfers resulted in greater reduction in income Gini, these changes were still inadequate to fully compensate for the surges in market inequality before taxes in this period. So we all heard about the inequality trend in North America, for example, and most of the inequality increase there is actually caused by the market inequality, so the market distribution. Actually, the fiscal policy, the redistributive policies played a role in bringing, like compensating for some of the inequality increases in the market distribution, but it proved not adequate. And in developing countries, the role of taxes and transfers, the redistribution measures were even less. So next slide, please. So what are the policy implications from the observation? First, to build forward fairer, policy efforts would also need to be proactive, to proactively shape structural and market forces that determine inequality levels and trends in the first place. Second, for fiscal policies, greater attention should be devoted to using taxes and spending to tilt such structural and market forces in favor of inclusive development, rather than focusing purely and narrowly on the monetary redistributive effect. Next slide, please. So economic structural transformation also provides a unique lens for understanding how inequality dynamics are driven by structural and market forces, especially in developing countries at a relatively early stage of development. So the traditional hypothesis of Kuznets, as shown here, speculates that the income inequality trend is primarily driven by labor relocation from low productivity sectors to high productivity sectors, and will first increase inequality before a subsequent decline following an inverted U-shaped curve. So as you can see here now, after if we taken the post-industrialization stage into account, the shape can be an extended N-shaped curve. Next slide, please. However, contemporary consensus suggests that this trajectory, as speculated by Kuznets, is neither a deterministic path nor a universal law. So this chart shows the before tax Gini trajectory of Asia-Pacific countries between 1990 and 2019. So the implication of structural transformation on inequality is a complex process in which factors such as leading sectors in the structural transformation, globalization, availability, and access to economic opportunities and technology can all potentially affect the interaction between structural transformation and inequality dynamics. And the national experience demonstrates significant diversities in the inequality development pathways, and this actually implies that there is ample space for policies to play a role. In particular, growing with equity was achieved in developing Asia-Pacific countries in both in the past, such as in the examples of early Asian dragons and tigers in different episodes of their economic takeoffs, and also in the more recent cases such as Bangladesh, Cambodia, Vietnam, and to a lesser extent, Pakistan. Next slide, please. Okay, we have another missing slide here. I don't know what's the tactical glitch here. But let me just try to sum up in words. So what we found, like after we observed this trend, we ask ourselves that what are the conducive factors and harmful factors for growing with equity, to achieve growing with equity in developing countries. So we found that fast and the sustained creation of productive jobs is a first and foremost conducive factor for growing with equity, and especially through the development of manufacturing, as past experience show. Second, universal access to primary and secondary education is another conducive factor Equalized access to infrastructure and essential public services is a third conducive factor for growing with equity. And the last but not least, a fairer starting point, such as like fairer land distribution achieved by land reforms in early stage of development and rural development are also conducive for growing with equity. And the challenges, some of the challenges for growing with equity to be realized include employment concentration in informal and low productivity sectors. A youth budge would create challenges for inclusive development as well. And in particular, job market segmentation and geographic fragmentation, which restrict access to quality jobs, would play an important role to prevent growing with equity from happening. Next slide. Okay, stay on for this slide. So in terms of the policies, like how to mobilize policies to guide structural transformation towards a more inclusive path, we identified three areas for action. First, that government can better guide structural transformation towards a job-rich path. So this includes mobilize support for strategic sectors, that is the manufacturing sector in the traditional experience, and more recently in the modern services sector, such as ICT services, professional services, and financial services, so on and so forth. And the second, countries can leverage public research and development investment and public support for R&D to boost the productivity growth and support the creation of new jobs in new sectors. So one interesting observation is that most of the job creation actually happens in new sectors rather than the expansion of the old sectors. So investing in the public support for innovation, R&D, and the creation of new jobs in new sectors would be very important in the process. And third, governments can try to establish correct market signals for private sector technological choices. So what does it mean? For example, if most of the taxes fall on payrolls, as in many countries, rather than on capital incomes, this is actually an advantage for more capital incentive production rather than labor intensive production, which actually triggers a distortion against employment. So it's making sure that the market signals is in favor of more labor-friendly development and technological innovation would be of importance here. The second, government can try to shape the income distribution outcomes of the market in the first place. So first, government can strengthen labor's position in the job market. So this can be done through like stronger trade unions or labor protection laws. But this can also be done through empowering the labor in corporate decision-making process, as we can see in the co-determination example in the case of Germany, for example, where the labor force plays a very important role in not only safeguarding the interest of the labor, but also in decision-making in terms of innovation, capital investment, so on and so forth. And the evidence we collect so far seems to suggest that this co-determination or involving labor into corporate decision-making process is actually conducive for investment and also for innovation and productivity growth. And third, the government can prioritize equal access in education policies. This would be very important to make sure that everybody has the equal chance to have access in quality jobs, which has the minimum skill requirement. Lastly, that the countries can try to manage the socio-economic disruptions of technological innovation better by preserve progresses made in the broad-based social protection as the first line of defense. And second, by strengthening the support for on-job training, lifelong learning, and vocational education as the innovation picks up speed and the sectors, the replacement of old sectors and old jobs with new sectors and new jobs picks up speed, the re-education and lifelong learning would become much more important compared to before. And lastly, in the extreme scenario, that when technological innovation is just too disruptive to destabilize the society or hurt the labor force too much, government may also consider like policy measures to keep the technological changes at a more manageable pace and try to avoid significant social disruptions. Next slide, please. So To sum up, here are some of the key takeaways. First, inclusion should be at the center of post-pandemic recovery and long-term development policies. Second, governments in the region should focus on efficiency and the impact of fiscal policies and avoid cuts in education, health, and social expenditure spending in fiscal consolidations. And third, expand the domestic revenues, shifting the burden away from low-income households, and then try to redesign monetary policies, reserve management, and innovative finance and digital currency for inclusive development. Last but not least, governments can try to proactively shape market outcomes to promote a job-rich transformation and empower the labor in the market distribution of income and wealth. So with that, next slide. Thank you very much. I hope I didn't take too much time. Thank you.
Thank you, Zhang, for a very detailed presentation, clearly setting agenda for monetary and fiscal policy at the country levels, and some very key messages coming from your presentation. And I think one of the key messages, while we'll be having a detailed presentation in Pakistani context in next session, but just I think two key messages that are very relevant to Pakistan. That is the dwindling fiscal space. Particularly, Pakistan has a very unique sort of characteristics when COVID hit the world. Actually, we were already following very contractionary monetary and fiscal policy. We were on the stabilization route, and Pakistan has already hit the growth rate of 1.9%. The time COVID-19 hit the country, so fiscal space was very limited at that time. And now when there is sort of a recovery phase going on, which needs sort of a broader fiscal space to finance this recovery. Pakistan is again struggling with its fiscal space and fiscal consolidations. So this is a very important message. But the second message, this is where I will bring our next special remarks from Mr. Ali Kemal Saab, who is Chief SDGs at Planning Commission of Pakistan, is that I think one of the key messages, if we can summarize, is what we are calling it at SDPI is that the world need to take an SDGs all in SDGs approach while designing recovery policies. SDGs agenda need to be put at the heart at fiscal and monetary policies. And finally, a good part that we have been doing, luckily in Pakistan, that we have already on social that is in terms of your inclusive, very clearly.
When I came to SDG section at the Planning Commission, I talked to Dr. Sajid and Dr. Hamza Malik at the UNESCAP that we should do something on the macro model, which gives us some estimates of investment required to achieve SDG. By Jeffrey Sachs the other day, that we need $470 trillion per year globally to achieve SDGs, and we are just putting in globally $44 billion as an official development assistance. So this means that 1% of GDP, 1% of the total required financing for globally to achieve SDGs. And in the next 10 years, it will be 10%. So we are short of 90% of the financing globally. So in Pakistan, the situation is not very different, but we have certain governance issues. So if we take care of those governance issues, we can achieve SDGs. So it's not very difficult, but it's a path for the development, for a good development policy. That if we may not achieve certain targets into 2030, we may achieve in 2035. But it's a good agenda to follow that, and what we need investment in that. I will be very brief because my secretary is here and he will talk more about it. One of the two main points of the presentation, and which we have already discussed with Dr. Syed and Dr. Hamza a few months ago, that fiscal stimulus is very harmful when we are in recession. And our friends always ask us that there's a twin deficit and you are not going to spend money on the fiscal. You're going to increase your taxes, you're going to decrease your expenditure, and that's how you can control your balance of payments deficit. So that's one of the major outcome of this study, and several of the studies that fiscal stimulus is the one to go in when we have recession, and fiscal consolidation is the way to go when you have a normal growth. So that's a good sign that this study has proved that point again. And the main point, as a macroeconomist, when the monetary is there, so we are very happy to see this kind of conclusion that central bank should and can promote inclusive development, and it may create the inequality. That's one of the bigger conclusion of this study, and the study which Dr. Syed has done a year ago at the SDPI as well. So I'll stop here and we will move forward. Before I stop, thanks to UNESCAP, SDPI, and my peers at the Planning Commission, due to which we are organizing this seminar as a policy dialogue. And yesterday we had a very good capacity building workshop in which we have trained around 15 to 20 participants in person, and fewer online as well. So I'm hoping that those participants will have some kind of simulation exercise and give us some numbers that what should we do, how much social protection do we require to achieve SDGs as far as the poverty is concerned. Thank you.
Thank you, Ali, for a very brief and comprehensive intervention. This really saves us time for the next speakers as well. And I just sort of take you one point, and that is really that the kind of capacity building workshops or the trainings that we are doing is just a beginning towards sort of we are aiming to have a more evidence-based policy planning. And this really becomes very important for countries like Pakistan, who are really struggling on financing recovery from COVID-19. So efficient investments, that is really critical. And this is the message coming on from UNESCAP, the overall Asia-Pacific survey as well. So with this, let me invite today's guest of honor, Syed Zafar Ali Shah Sahab. He is Secretary, Ministry of Planning, Development and Special Initiatives. Over to you, sir, for your comments, please.
Thank you very much. Very kind. Bismillah Rahmani. On behalf of Ministry of Planning, Development and Special Initiatives, I would like to express my appreciation to our partners of this policy dialogue, both UNESCAP and the SDPI, and of course the SDG unit of planning. So planning is part of convening this session. I also appreciate the presence of all the guests. And also the chief guest sitting with me and other colleagues. I believe that this is a very timely policy dialogue, and UNESCAP, I'm aware of its annual reports because let me admit at the onset that I have stayed for 6 years in the Pakistan Embassy in Bangkok. So I was the alternate rep of Pakistan in the UNESCAP. So I had the pleasure of contributing and presenting Pakistan's point of view in this UN for Asia. So that was a good experience. Every year we look forward to the coming out of this survey report. And so it would be very informative. And I would just say again, seeing this report in today's session and just before that, that it is a continuation of that excellent trend which UNESCAP has set over the years since 1947. The next point that I would like to highlight is that it's also very important, and that is what we are doing, is to hold a policy dialogue. Like we have these excellent reports, excellent depiction of the various indicators of the region, the kind of similarities in the region and the kind of disparities in the region. When you look at the ASCAP reports, you always find sub-regions. And sometimes you wonder whether all the countries in those regions are very similar or maybe they have differences. And then in the last 20 years, I think UNESCAP has also witnessed the regional countries, very different growth patterns, development patterns, maturity of economic models. So that is still very interesting, but a lot of things can be learned. And the world has also progressed by focusing on regions. So I think UN overall and UNESCAP has played a very important role. Now coming to Pakistan specific issues. This report talks about the COVID recovery. COVID was a phenomena which hit us. And for a couple of years, I think we were just on the back foot till the vaccine came in and the world bounced back. Similarly, it was the pattern for our economic growth trajectories and how our people faced those problems. The one aspect of it, I think, which was that the world was facing it. So although the issues got compounded because the world was facing it, but also we had lessons learned, we had international cooperation, we had the vaccine research coming in, the vaccines arriving, and then greater international cooperation. So Pakistan also went through this phase. Its people suffered a lot because of the economic shutdowns like other countries, although some countries found different policies. But we went for almost negative growth, -1% at a time. Then we started recovering and 5% and 5.97% growth. So the growth was back. Now the challenges as identified in the presentation as well as in the reports is when the growth is there, that's a very healthy phenomena. But one, you were taken aback, you went back by a few percentage points. So you lost a few years. So you are trying to recover. That is one point. And second, how is the growth being redistributed or distributed? So then the questions of income redistribution, the Gini coefficient that was mentioned, all those factors, the people matter, and for that, the growth matters. So not only the recovery, the growth, that are very important aspects, but it's also how the growth will be distributed. So I think when the report talks about the challenges and how we have to recover back and make it a more fairer one so that no one remains back. These are key areas. The macroeconomic modeling for Pakistan, I just learned that ASCAP has done it for all the countries, the wider framework. But for Pakistan, it was done over the last 1 year. So I think it's a very good, important effort by SDPI and of course supported by ASCAP to focus on Pakistan and build up for different scenarios because every country has specific situation. So evidence-based decision making for that, it will be a very good report and a good effort, and trainings have been conducted, capacity building is part of the exercise. So I appreciate all these points. Now, just talking about Pakistan, I would just like to give the situation. Most of it is in front of all learned people like yourself, but still, as a planning secretary, some of the efforts that we are taking back. One is that although last year we had difficult circumstances, we somehow achieved 5.97% growth based on some agriculture recovery and on the services sector. For the next year also, the government, despite fiscal consolidation and the macroeconomic stability challenges, has taken a very ambitious target. It's 5% that we have set. the Prime Minister then encouraged us to go for ambitious 6%, because 5% post-COVID sounds healthy region-wise, but he said that we should strive for 6%. And then we face this macroeconomic difficulties and the fiscal consolidation. Last year, the deficit was pretty high side. And then the import-led inflation coming into the country, various international crises, the prices of imports increasing, the shortage of dollars. So very challenging circumstances where the government is trying to grapple not only with those challenges, but also come up with something which is beneficial for the people, because after all, it's the people of Pakistan, the 220 million that count. What I can just inform you, and this has happened in the last few months, that maybe we have taken a few key steps on the road back to recovery. So UNESCAP, very important forum, I would like to share with them and through them to the world that the first few steps of macroeconomic stability have been taken. And that is one measure of that, which is that the IMF has given us kind of go ahead, that they are watching the policies of the government and they believe that the macroeconomic stability is on the way. So that is a message which will bring us back to those kind of debates where we can focus more on growth. We still face very high inflation. These are interesting ideas where we say that the central bank should play a major role. And this was part of the debate. So that is very interesting. But you see, that is also a challenge for the state central banks. And I would have loved to hear from them also if they were present today, that should they just focus on inflation or growth or both? So that is a challenge for them. So in the short term, what I envisaged and what I saw, that because the interest rates were hiked in Pakistan, it was more to tame the inflation. And this inflation was partly domestic, but mostly also internationally led because of the international crisis. So I think the world has to play its role. There should be greater peace in the world, greater connectivity, and also within the domestic circumstances, the government should focus more, it's rightly pointed out, on fiscal consolidation, but then also creating the fiscal space. This year, our budget is almost 9.5 trillion rupees. And while the budget keeps on expanding, but we have to look at reducing the fiscal deficit to reduce inflation. So inflation is the biggest enemy of everybody, but especially the poor. And when we talk of a fairer regime, I think inflation is its enemy. So taming inflation, which is the central bank is doing, that is good. Reducing the deficit, that is good. But then having the resources for development and actually helping the poor, key challenges for the government. Again, in the last 3 months, I can just quickly share with you 2-3 examples. One, despite the difficult circumstances, we kept the federal PSDP at 800 billion rupees, which is appreciable, because last year in the last quarter we couldn't release any money because of the fiscal consolidation exercise. So in that perspective, keeping 800 billion rupees federal and 2.2 trillion is the total provincial, along with the provincial, the PSDP. So it's healthy in our circumstances. This year we have kept a 7.4 trillion fiscal revenue, tax revenue target, which is again healthier because it's a growth of more than 20%. And that also, the effort was to tax those who can afford and give certain exemptions to those who cannot. Then also, energy is a crisis, food security. So the government this year in our development program has focused more on water resources. And the perspective is, if we conserve water, which is an important commodity, helps us all around, helps us in agriculture in the short-term growth. It also leads us to food security. And food security is again a very important factor for the poor of a country, for the middle income, and also everybody in the country, and it helps taming inflation again. So these are some efforts that have been done. Also, the focus on, like it was mentioned in the report, on health, education, and smart spending. So smart spending requires better governance. So one, like in the provinces, the most of this expenditure happens. So that has been continued. And secondly, in the governance area, a number of reforms are being undertaken. So which will help us to use these resources in a much better way. The SDG, Pakistan National Commitment, we were the first country to focus or take up SDGs as part of our international commitment, because it is something good for the people of Pakistan. And before the COVID hit us, I think we were having a good trajectory. We had increased our index by about 10 points on the SDG development front. COVID hit us. We had like a stoppage there, but now with the present consolidation, and we also trying to harness the private sector resources. So this is going to again help us go back to that kind of a growth, which is then inclusive also. We have focused on afforestation. We have focused on establishing, reviving the Cpac, which is very important. It brought in almost $18 billion of investment in the 13 to 18 period. So when we are reviving it, we again envisage cleaner energy, more better transportation, and bringing in a few $1 billion of investment in the short term. The Prime Minister has also asked us, and we are working on that with our different partners, for a short-term growth strategy. Growth is always a long-term process, but because of the circumstances that the government is in, it has almost a year mandate. It is focusing on one-year growth measures, and in that also includes focus on agriculture, because agriculture can really give us quicker returns. Very recently, some very key decisions have been taken for agriculture transformation. I believe within this year, you can see good results on all our major crops and also on livestock. So agriculture will give us that boost, which can really take us from to 5% and maybe to 6%. Similarly, in the energy sector, the harnessing of waters, like I mentioned, then we face these new challenges, the climate change, which the world recognizes the problem has been created overall by the rapid industrialization that we saw in the last 5, 6, 7 decades. But Pakistan is one of the sufferers from that, and this year is one of the worst hit that we are facing. But I think within the space, Benazir Income Support Program was mentioned. Almost $2 billion are given to the people through cash transfers. So that is one element. But within this devastating floods which we are facing, the government is working on all fronts. On relief, recently in Balochistan, almost 20 billion rupees were directly put in the accounts of the poor of those districts through the BISP mechanism. And now we are going to do it for the other people, direct cash transfers to those people. So that is one aspect of our help, but we will also go for rehabilitation, reconstruction, where we will build climate resilient structures. So this is also a part of the government ambitious agenda. The government has the vision 2025. The same government is back in place. It was an interregnum, but again, this is a foundation for the short-term, medium-term policies, and that envisages human development as an important element. It also talks about the regional connectivity, the benefits that it can bring in, and also harnessing private resources, because as it was rightly pointed out, the resources of the public sector are limited given the fiscal consolidation exercise. But it is the private sector investment that can help in. Recently, we are working on a 300 billion private sector mobilization program just for a single major road project. So that is the kind of extra efforts that we are making to make really our growth strong, sustainable, and inclusive. Now, coming back to again this present day exercise, I would just appreciate again the host SDPI, the UNESCAP, because they provided us this forum where we can again talk about the issues that we are facing. And I understand while we talk about the way forward, the solutions are there, They are not easy to be dealt with. They are not, they will not be over in the next 6 months or 1 year. But always when we sit together, we find some better solutions than before. And always we take a few more steps on the way forward. So I appreciate today's participants for their presence and our key partners. And I look forward that such exercises, such research, such evidence-based exercises will help the government both at the federal and the provincial level to form better policies for all its people. Thank you very much.
Sir, thank you for an excellent snapshot of economic challenges facing the government and the priority agenda of the government. And we really share your sort of concern and the focus on people's matter. So that is exactly the key message that is coming out of it. This brings me to move towards our concluding remarks from our chief guest today. And we really have a double thanks to our chief guest. The one is that joining us, and the one is that joining us on a very short notice. We're really thankful to Miss Shahnaz Akbar Aziz.
Sorry, Mehnaz.
Ji Mehnaz. Member, National Assembly of Pakistan. She is currently a parliamentary secretary for law and justice, and she has been a very vocal and big voice on inclusivity and putting people over economics. Over to you, ma'am. Thank you.
बहुत शुक्रिया जी. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. First of all, I would like to thank the SDGs unit, Ali Kemal Sahab, for being, you know, the central person for, you know, grounding us in SDGs. Zafar Shah Sahab, Secretary of Ministry of Planning and Development, and I'm very impressed by his speech. Not just speech, but the actions that the ministry is taking right now, and especially through the PSDP, that will ease what we are talking about, you know, and that will be very helpful for inclusivity. And Abid Suleri Sahab, Dr. Sahab, he's my brother. And I think when I started my career in development sector, which is like 25, 30 years ago, I've always seen him as a mentor. And especially as a parliamentarian, SDPI, his entire stellar team, and I'm really glad there is, you know, continuity. I see the same people, so they're very committed to what they're doing. But turning around to him all the time for guidance is you know, amazing. And also, I would like to mention here that SDPI is like our conscience. You know, they remind us of the in these very difficult times. I think throughout Pakistan's history, we mention difficult times, but being a constant constituency politician, these times are especially very hard because it's about, anyhow, I will talk in detail soon after. So, you know, there are very few organizations, I mean, I can't think of any others, who would be doing work such as SDPI, research, evidence, data, because and they have become like a support mechanism for the government of Pakistan. And Abid bhai, thank you so much for doing what you're doing. And I would also like to thank Mr. Zhang. You know, I was listening very carefully. It was like a tutorial for me, your entire presentation. And your colleagues who from UNESCAP, who have joined us online from Bangkok and other offices. Thank you so much for doing this for Pakistan and with Pakistan, all our international partners. I was so happy to see Esther this morning here, the representative of IMF, who is, you know, who's left for her office right now. So, and I see UNICEF and others. So it's very important that we work together. And we work together towards the inclusivity of, you know, the women, children, minorities, affected, COVID affected, flood affected, we have to work on the inclusivity side of it. So today, I'll speak from my heart, and I will bring my perspective from the parliament, as a parliamentarian, as an elected woman parliamentarian, and from the voices from my constituency. I'm on a proxy seat. Women generally cannot. It's very difficult for them to contest general seats. That's the reality of Pakistan. That's what I've learned in 4 years. And you have to rely on, a husband, a brother, a father giving you way to the constituency seat. But what my learning in these 4 years has been that a lot can happen. The parliamentarians, especially the ones with constituencies, not as opposed to being on reserve seats, that's very important as well for women. But we need to work hand in hand with our ministries and with our partners. And so, the international partners as well. While I was going through listening to your presentation, two important components. COVID-19, how Pakistan fared very well in that, has become a model, while unfortunately our neighboring India was in very dire conditions. So, and also stepping back from that, dengue in Punjab 4 or 5 years ago, the way we managed, how did it work? So if we look through it, and the compelling need to help out the flood affected, unfortunately, I don't see that kind of help coming forward. And I'm not going to talk, being a constituency politician and being from the development sector, I don't like to make, statements, generalized statements. So there has to be people-to-people contact. And I think that today we are missing that. We are missing the parliamentarians' voices, and we are missing the people's voices. And the local body system is very important to connect all of that. And when we are going forward with the good work that we are doing, we must remember that Pakistan, as Secretary Saab also indicated, the numbers, our population, that it's a very huge country, and we cannot work with the people and think that we are inclusive and we are reaching out to all the people without a system, a local body system in Pakistan. So that has to be, we have to keep that in the forefront of it all. I'm very happy to report from the parliament that, while we were celebrating our golden jubilee on the, going on to 14th of August, what we did this year was unprecedented in the history of Pakistan, that we had sessions with parliamentary sessions with children, minorities, and women for the first time in the history of Pakistan. So it's not just one-off thing, but it is to recognize them and to assure them their voices are heard. But do we leave it at there? Now it's up to our government partners. I'm also part of the government, but the machinery of the government, which is very important, and that holds the key to our fiscal space, and to the international partners who hold the key to our fiscal space as well. And we can help in a very strong partnership of bringing the voices of our constituencies. It's extremely, extremely important to work with youth, children, women, and minorities, and to make sure that they are included in each space, in each step of any policy making decisions, any roundtables, any trainings. It's extremely important. And while I'm sitting here, and today is like a learning, I feel I'm in a class of learning. And I was hoping that this similar session can be done with my fellow parliamentarians. We can do, we all need to. We are all working for the people. And today I bring the voices of the people to you. And, healthcare, we need to improve upon our primary healthcare, tertiary healthcare, from district headquarter hospitals, tehsil headquarter hospitals, that is extreme. What provisions are being offered by private sector, and how is the government doing? Because in this pool of crises, one crisis after the other, and especially the fiscal and the polarization in the country, I think we need to come back to focusing on, because the people of Pakistan, what we read on Twitter, what we read on the political space and others, people of Pakistan want to have normal lives. Children want to have normal lives, and women, minorities, all want to earn. And what I didn't hear a lot today was on job creation. Because when I go to the constituency, the entire discourse is on more jobs. So while we cannot provide those kind of jobs, let's bring entrepreneurship again to the space. And provide funding and providing fiscal space for entrepreneurship, whether it's in education or in other areas. Social protection was mentioned, and I think it's a very important area, but I think without a sound local body system, whatever we do from a centralized perspective will not be as effective, because we need to get to each district, each division, each tehsil, and have a representational scenario, not a political perspective to that. I feel that our interprovincial coordination ministry is not doing as much as it should be doing. It's a sleepy ministry. I'm sorry about saying that, but post 18th Amendment, I think in you know what we are looking at in the flood situation today, Balochistan, Southern Punjab, Sindh, if we have that level of coordination that we can have a say, the center, we the parliamentarians who are concerned about Pakistan can have a say and are not restricted to our area of governance only. And that can be done very well through the machinery, the planning ministry and IPC as well. So also I would like to mention here that Mr. Zhang was talking about central bank and others. In my recent visit to the constituency, one of the most pressing need was excessive billing on WABDA bills, electricity. And they just brought the bills to me and they said, don't do anything for us, just pay our bills. So these are units, village homes that don't, sometimes they do not even have lights. So, but I'm not going to talk about problems only. So what is the solution? The government has given subsidy on solar. So why don't we focus on giving solar access to at least rural areas? Because I cannot, and the Ministry of Planning and Development cannot, and the central bank cannot provide for the bills. So how do we create solutions? Because that is taking away from the nutrition of the family, that is taking away from the education and from the healthcare as well. The list is long. I can continue as a parliamentarian, as an elected member, I can continue talking about whatever the issues are. And it's great to see that in COVID we were a success story, but we need to continue these islands of successes, which was and it was a national concerted effort. There was a national coordinating unit that was doing it. So we can't let go of our provinces. I'm very supportive of the 18th Amendment, of of the provinces being independent. But we need to, as a nation, at some points, we need to come together as well. So, and the issues that we have today of inflation, etc., we are together facing it. So, concluding, I think that we need to take these the findings of the report, these partnerships, and working together we need to have sessions with parliamentarians as well. And when we are writing these reports and we are collecting data, we need to have some samples of from the constituencies, from the people, go into a constituency and have, some areas that would be, rather than just doing a very, like the way we do our economic surveys and otherwise. So coming to the end of this session, I think it's very important. What we need, I would remember my late father-in-law, Chaudhry Anwar Aziz Saab, and he would always say, he was known as the father of politics. So he would say that if you don't have anything, speak sweetly, meetha bolo. So at this point in time, the parliamentary, me, as a parliamentarian with nothing in my hands, when I go to my constituency, I hug the women, the children, and the elders, and I speak very sweetly, and I tell them that things will be okay. But we all need to work together to make it work, and for things to be okay to each individual in Pakistan, and that is through policy. And all of you are very important in formulation of policy and taking along all the policy makers. And I would insist at the end, then please do include parliamentarians. Insist on the men also coming. Women are very good in their parliamentary business, but also do insist that men who are in the front benches come to your sessions. Thank you so much, and really appreciate coming together. And thank you so much, Abid Bhai. Khuda Hafiz. Pakistan Zindabad.
Thank you, ma'am, for bringing us really people voice on this forum, and we really will be reaching you out again for engaging parliamentarians, women parliamentarians particularly, as you suggested. Before we break for the tea, 5 minutes, and rejoin for a more perspective and more contextual discussion on Pakistan, let me invite Dr. Suleri for a vote of thanks for this session.
I think perhaps vote of thanks. There are no words to express my thanks to all the participants who joined us from 10 a.m. this morning, and also those who have joined us online, but also the panelists. Excellent presentation from Zhang. Thanks for all the way coming from Bangkok and sharing your perspective here. For Ali Kemal and Zafar Shah Sahab, for assuring that it's not the government only, or the civil society, or the private sector. It's a collective effort that all of us we have to make. SDPI team for organizing it so brilliantly, and for Mehnaz Akbar Sahaba, of course, joining us. We always take her as one of us from development sector. Sajid perhaps forgot to mention her excellent work on early childhood development. So she is one of the experts who have done tremendous work on early childhood development before she entered in active politics, and she still continues working on it. So as I said, that when we talk of leaving no one behind, it means that none of us should be reluctant to pool our efforts. It's a collective cause, and collective efforts can actually make it happen. So if we believe in leaving no one behind, we should also contribute towards achieving that goal, that we do a collective effort. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
So thank you. Thank you, Ji. We can now take your cup of tea and rejoin back to have your perspectives from the other side of the table. Next, please. Thank you. So we have 5 minutes. Just take your tea and we can join.
बिस्मिल्लाहिर्रहमानिर्रहीम। मैं हूं आपकी होस्ट सादिया सत्ती और आज के SDTV बुलेटिन में मैं आपके साथ लेके आई हूं डिफरेंट स्टोरीज, जिसमें हम आज बात करेंगे मुल्क में होने वाली मौसमियाती तब्दीलियों के बारे में, क्लीन ग्रीन इस्लामाबाद के बारे में, और हमारा फोकस होगा ग्रीन एनर्जी कॉकस पर। इसके अलावा मैं आपके साथ शेयर करूंगी कोरोना किस तरह से मुल्क की मौसमी सिचुएशन को टारगेट कर रहा है। मौसमियाती तब्दीलियों के बायस किस तरह माहौल को साफ बनाया जा सकता है। इस सिलसिले में आइए देखते हैं इकोसिस्टम रेस्टोरेशन पे SDTV की एक रिपोर्ट। मौसमियाती तब्दीलियों को मद्देनजर रखते हुए हम इस्लामाबाद को कैसे क्लीन, ग्रीन और साफ बना सकते हैं, इस बारे में आइए हम आपके साथ शेयर करते हैं एक रिपोर्ट। मुल्क में बढ़ती हुई कोरोना के बाइस पाकिस्तान में लोग 40% से ज़्यादा गुर्बत का शिकार हो गए हैं। कोविड किस तरह से हमारे तालीम के निज़ाम को, सेहत के निज़ाम को और माशी निज़ाम को मुतासिर कर रहा है, आइए उस पर नज़र डालते हैं।
Similarly, about 40% more people have gone down the poverty line, below poverty line. And the government is not in a position financially to provide them financial aid or assistance. Many people are losing their jobs. So therefore, in our country, in Pakistan, industry is affected, agriculture is affected, because then growth will be affected if people cannot really afford to. Because with this, the inflation has come up. There is unemployment, more unemployment. That has added to the miseries of the people. And when people are not healthy, they are not financially well off, then they cannot really be the part of the engine of the growth. And that is a big loss. So therefore, while the government of Pakistan is trying its best to really cope up with the situation and public is cooperating, we pray and hope that we control this pandemic. The worst hit is again education, because the children are out of school, and unless and Pakistan is not that advanced that you will have people will work on the internet system, and they cannot, online education is not at all feasible in countries like Pakistan, because some are well-developed areas, but many far-flung areas like Balochistan, like our ex-tribal belt, interior of Sindh and all that, and even in interior of Pakistan, the rural Punjab area, their children are not well aware to really get their proper education online, and their parents are not also very educated to help them to get that education. So these are the impacts, and I hope the nation, by the grace of Allah, we expect will stand up to fight this challenge and help the government, and the government will leave no stone unturned really to minimize these difficulties of the people. Big challenges come, but then the towering leadership really faces those challenges and overcomes that. And we hope and pray Pakistan leadership will also stand up and face this challenge along with the entire Pakistani nation. United Nations plan of Sustainable Development Goals was a very good plan. That was to help poor countries and third world countries to fix their goals and then try to achieve those goals within a stipulated time up to 2030. But now with this pandemic, there has been a lot of adverse impact on the achievement of these goals. And therefore, I think United Nations may have to reconsider as to whether this time frame is realistic or no, because the countries must try. They must try to meet these goals within the stipulated time frame. But I feel that because still we don't see light at the end of the tunnel. There is a vaccine of all types. Some people say it is 90% effective, others say it is 60%, some say it is 50%. And those people who are getting vaccinated, even those are being exposed to COVID attacks. So there is an uncertain situation. So therefore, I feel that this goal of 2030, with those 19 goals or 17 goals which have been fixed, I don't think so that poor countries who are coping up, who are fighting COVID-19 and trying to mitigate the difficulties will be able to meet these goals.
जी नाज़रीन, तो अब हम आपके साथ शेयर करते हैं आज की आखिरी रिपोर्ट। आइए देखते हैं SDPI की ग्रीन एनर्जी कॉकस के बारे में एक रिपोर्ट।
ऑल सॉर्ट ऑफ सपोर्ट जो है वो SDPI प्रोवाइड करने के लिए तैयार है। पार्लियामेंटेरियंस का ये अपना इनिशिएटिव होगा कि स्पेसिफिकली क्लीन एनर्जी पे वो एक अपना कॉकस जो है वो पार्लियामेंट में तश्कील दें, जो कि सेनेट में भी हो, नेशनल असेंबली में भी हो।
यहाँ पे आप एक पार्लियामेंटेरियंस का एक फोरम बनाने की तजवीज़ लेकर के आए, और अगर ये बनता है विद एक्शन ओरिएंटेड प्लान कि आपके सामने हो, ये हैं लंबा चौड़ा, इसको आगे जाने की ज़रूरत नहीं होगी। आप अपने गोल्स अचीव करें, डेस्टिनेशन सेट करें, और उसके बीच में मीटिंग्स बहुत होती हैं, लेकिन अगर हम एक्शन प्लान सामने रख दें कि हमने पहुंचना किधर है, क्या चीज़ अचीव करनी है, तो इससे बेहतरीन आइडिया हो ही नहीं सकता। ब्रेन्स हैं ज़बरदस्त, काम करना चाहते हैं, और अगर ऐसा कोई फोरम बन जाता है।
जो रिपोर्ट है, द रिपोर्ट विल बी यूजिंग विद लैंड मिनिस्ट्रीज और मिनिस्ट्री ऑफ प्लानिंग डेवलप, द मिनिस्ट्री ऑफ प्लानिंग विल बी यूजिंग इट इन कंसल्टेशन विद मिनिस्ट्री नेशनल हेल्थ सर्विसेज एंड रेगुलेशंस टू devise their projects and process them further. I don't think so that there is much to say at this point, but when we get these projects materialized in light of this evidence, then I think we'll be in a better position to do any further actions. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. I really appreciate your the kind of commitment and the sort of ownership. It's really encouraging to see you coming because one of the key spending or investment that is really having a very long-lasting impact on inclusive recovery from COVID-19 is the spending in health. May I invite Ali Kemal if he is around? हमें ज्वाइन किया है तालपुर साहब ने ऑनलाइन? No? So you can play my presentation till then. I'll take this opportunity to give a context of Pakistan, particularly for those who were not with us yesterday. So please apologize. I mean, we excuse if you find repetition, if you can. So this is exactly just a summary of the work that we have done in context of Pakistan. So next, please. This was the overall three key areas of inquiry in this work on Pakistan. The first is the socio-economic impact of COVID-19 on Pakistan. And then we evaluate actually to what extent the fiscal stimulus, the fiscal policy response was helpful in mitigating the impacts of COVID-19. And then we also assess what is the available fiscal space and vis-a-vis what is the required financing and where can that financing come from. Next, please. So these are some of the contributions that we think that our work has made. It provides you, it's like Zhang's presentation, sort of more or less the similar stuff, that it presents a macro model, some evidence on this one, and some capacity building workshops that we wanted to continue. Next, please. So just go on some of the findings. So you can go next, please. Again, next. Yes. Next. One slide behind. So this is exactly the key summary findings arising from this work, and they are more or less resonating with Zhang's key finding coming from the overall survey. That is one, the Pakistan must increase social spending, and by social spending we mean health, education, and social protection. The second is actually that Pakistan must continue to push for a mass vaccination policy. Remember that work was, the first part was taken in 2020, and there was very high fear that Pakistan will be having a very inequitable access to vaccination, but luckily that came opposite, and Pakistan is really performing good on vaccination. The third was that Pakistan need to ensure balanced green funding in order to have a green recovery from COVID-19. And finally, for a forward-looking recovery which is sustainable, it was on digital infrastructure, as Zhang highlighted, that digital divide can sort of translate into long-term structural inequalities. And I'll just give one example that why is this so important. You know, the learning losses, the learning outcome losses in the education sector can translate into your sort of employability chances in the labor market in the long term, so that they may have an intergenerational impact. Similarly, the changing nature of work, the remote working, so that to a large extent depends on your adaptability and access to digitization and digital modes. So the sectors, the people, the skills, the occupations which are more flexible, more adaptable, more access to digitalization may be having more sort of better recovery compared to those who really lost those chances. So that is why this was very critical. Next, please. So this is some of, I've just picked up some glimpses here on this one. The one is that where do we stand in current spendings and the required spending, and what is the financing gap? If you can see the bottom slide, even it's the current spending on social protection as 3.9% of GDP overall. The minimum required to have some sort of effective threshold impact of social protection based on this model was that we need to have 9.6% of the GDP, and we ended up a big gap on $5.7 billion, roughly equal to the IMF program that Pakistan is having. Next, please. Similarly, if the greening, the transport sector requires till next 10 years $38.5 billion in total. So roughly it is $3.8 billion a year, more than 50% of the IMF program. So we also simulate how can private sector contribute. The model that we have tailored for Pakistan, developed by UNESCAP, that what if there is a contribution from public sector and private sector? So what can be the share? Next, please. You may move next. I'll just close it. So this is exactly the one key question that also came from Zhang's presentation, and overall, where will this come from? I mean, there is a huge financing gap. The one question was that where will this come from? As also highlighted by Zhang, and it holds true for Pakistan as well, that the fiscal space is likely to be remaining limited, rather shrinking over the time. So there will be new avenues, and the one is, next please, reprioritizing the expenditures. The government need to reprioritize expenditure, and if I can just give one example, next. Next please. So this is exactly the one example that in 2019 Pakistan gave coal and oil subsidies of roughly equal to $2 billion. So that is exactly, if you divide average of IMF program, we are getting $2 billion average per year, because it's 3 years program, $6 billion. So per annum, we are getting an average of $2 billion from IMF. It is the same amount that we are giving into subsidies. So if we can save 35%, 50% or 75% of those subsidies, it can give us $500 million to $1.5 billion saving from those subsidies. But definitely there is a question of political commitment. But thanks to IMF program, this is one thing that we are doing under pressure, that we have to cut these subsidies. Similarly, we have also estimated, based on available evidence as well, that how much we can save from sort of reducing inefficiencies in transport sector. The key theme is that the investments required for the sector can come from within the sector if we can reduce those subsidies. By reducing railway and trucking inefficiencies, Pakistan can save 4 to 6% of GDP. That is around 12 billion of GDP can be saved annually if we can reduce those inefficiencies. And if we can even reduce half of those, it's equal to IMF program actually. Next, please. So I'll just give one. Next. So these are some of the initiatives that government has taken on green financing. That the folder that you have, the studies are there, they highlight them in detail. Next, please. So this is some of the overall work that we have done in this. So I just thought to fill the gap while we wait the next speaker. Has Talpur Saab joined us? Okay, let me go to Ali Kemal Saab then. Ali Kemal Saab, over to you. I'm just told that Dr. Muhammad Ali Talpur Saab has joined us online. Talpur Saab, we are so sorry that we made you so much a long wait. Thank you for rejoining us. Talpur Saab is economic consultant, Ministry of National Food Security and Research. Sir, over to you for your special comments, please.
Thank you very much, honorable panelist and the participant. Thank you very much for inviting me to share my views with you. I highly appreciate the efforts of SDG unit, Ministry of Planning, Development and Special Initiatives, SDPI and UNICEF for arranging this dialogue. Let me go back to the experience that I have been witnessing since during COVID period, and then I will try to align it with the recommendations of the survey. Definitely, it was hard time, and everybody. Since I am particularly working on food security component of the government of Pakistan, so one thing that I would like to share with the House that the COVID has taught us some things. One of the most important things that we have learned from it, from this incident, is that it has twisted our brains to make the rapid and frequent decisions and align the data sources accordingly. So that was, I think, the main achievement that we can infer from the COVID scenario. So we developed our database system at a better pace, and our SDPI partner was even with us in providing such help for making the data available at the real-time level. So that was the main achievement that we occurred during this period, and that was the main, we can say, the objective. Now that we are harvesting the fruits of that real-time data for our decision-making system, in particularly our National Food Security Ministry. So the recommendations are main three components that the report has inferred. Mainly the fiscal align fiscal space with the development process. I would like to share that the government of Pakistan, keeping in view the significance of the food security in Pakistan, has been allocating better resources for the in order to ensure the food security of the country, and several projects to align the food security and the social growth as well as economic growth, and we can say in coordination with the SDG unit and with the objectives of sustainable development goals. The projects were designed and executed at Ministry of National Food Security level. So I have gone through the summary and the survey report. It has been definitely catering the policy guidelines for the several countries, including Pakistan. So I highly appreciate the work and the outcomes of the studies, and we will again think over the points that have been made, especially to align our future discourse. Thank you very much for allocating me some time. Thank you.
Sir, thank you so much. Let me now invite Dr. Waqar Ahmed, Joint Executive Director, SDPI, for his special remarks. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Sajid, and thank you to our co-organizing partners. I think I must commend the presentation we had in the morning by Mr. Zhang. I think it was very comprehensive, very clear messages coming out. I think we have to chalk the way forward from probably the later part of your presentation. And I think it does provide us the guidance. I could also see a reflection of that in the slides which Dr. Sajid Amin showed and the remarks which Mr. Ali Kemal had in the morning. Now, two or three things. First, I believe that this effort has to trickle down at a subnational level. So whatever we have discussed today as part of this dialogue has to really happen in the provincial capitals, in the provincial PNDs, and of course their SDG units can steer it, but of course it has to be a whole of the government effort at a province level. So that is my first and foremost comment, and I think it's important to also mention what the Honorable Ms. Mehnaz Akbar Aziz said in the morning, that while of course we are doing this at a federal level, and as I suggested that we should follow this up and have a provincial episodes of this as well. But what she said was also important, which was federal provincial coordination on this subject. So the recovery, a large part of your policy recommendations, which I see in the report, almost 65 to 70% of this is provincial subjects, including the inequalities in education, inequalities in health, access to clean drinking water. Now, of course, we're talking about floods. So most of the action will be happening, or action with respect to recovery, policies for recovery will be happening at the province level, which is why probably the ministry which she named, Ms. Mehnaz Akbar Aziz named, is extremely important, and they should play that coordination role going forward. My second take is that, of course, Secretary Planning was very articulate when he suggested that most part of this is also a function of funding. And given that the budgets are constrained, so it's not just the government which has to dedicate its resources, it's also players other than the government whose budget has to be routed towards the development over here. So probably in the next chapters of this discussion, one would like to see a greater participation of the private sector in this dialogue. That's one. And second, we need to be discussing the donor coordination architecture in more detail. While we understand that Prime Minister has just yesterday even given a call for recovery from floods and asked the development partners to come forward, again, the bigger question that comes is that of donor coordination. So even in this report, very comprehensive report by SDPI, the first one, I see that there's quite a large role of development partners who will be helping the recovery process, particularly the inclusive part around the recovery process, the resilience part around the recovery process. I think that's where the steer of the development partners is important, and we must guide the development partners when they come to help us, so that there isn't duplication, there isn't multiplicity of efforts, both at the national level as well as the subnational level. Probably the third area that I wanted to bring here is that of the diaspora. And talked enough about the macroeconomic stabilization, but just wanted to add over here that there are, if I had to pick one or two elements which have kept the current account stabilized, that was the inflows which we were receiving or are receiving from the diaspora. Today and tomorrow, because I think Mr. Zhang also discussed the role of the central bank. So today and tomorrow, central bank is leading a big effort trying to engage the diaspora flows and trying to rekindle the effort which we had in RDA, Roshan Digital Accounts, trying to expand the Islamic and Sharia compliant provisions under RDs as well. Now, when I was listening to some of the recommendations and thinking of which partners in the development process could help us to drive that forward, it's not just the money part that we want from the diaspora. It's also their knowledge. It's the ideas transfer, it's the knowledge transfer, technology transfer that they are now contributing. And this brings me to a very important point, which is the startup, the role of startups that we have seen in the past 3 or 4 years, and the innovative role that they have played during the COVID time, and they will continue to play as this recovery takes place. So many of the startups which started off in COVID on the back of greater online orientation are now arriving at a scale-up stage. Now, this is where those policies that we identified or are requesting the state bank to undertake, I think those policies can greatly help the scalability of what are what our startups are doing in the health space, in education space, and I do understand that in today's afternoon session we will be discussing EdTech as one of the areas which have come forward and helped the recovery process, not very evenly, of course, given the less or uneven internet penetration, but that is the area where we need to going forward. And of course, the startup aspect or the scalability of our startups and their role in recovery is very much linked to the youth engagement part, given that this is where the demographic dividend should be directed towards. So I'll just stop over here. Thank you, Dr. Sajid, for giving me the opportunity.
Dr. Kaur, thank you. Really setting a way forward agenda for us, SDPI and UNESCAP, ranging from the financing architecture to private sector engagement, and from federal provincial coordination to diaspora. I hope my colleague who has joined us online from UNESCAP Bangkok, Dr. Hamza Ali Malik, Director of Macroeconomic Policy and Financing for Development, will be touching upon when he sort of comes on for the concluding session. But now, before I move to Ali Kemal, as we have been keeping him so engaged over the last 2 years, actually, not only this session. So just to give him some break, I'll come to you for your questions. Any comments, remarks from the audience? Please raise your hand, tell your name, and if you're asking question, ask who you are asking. If you are giving comment, please welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Mirajul Haq, Assistant Professor, International Islamic University. First, I would like to appreciate SCAP, SDPI, and SDG wing to touch upon a very comprehensive survey report. The key message that can be drawn from this report is the most feasible way to cope with this COVID-19 challenges is fiscal policy, and especially this fiscal stimulus. But keeping in view the structure of the economy, that historically we are running our economy with 3 gaps: saving investment gap and huge trend deficit, fiscal gap, huge fiscal gap, and this trade gap. And secondly, the strict and demand management policy and stabilization policy of previous government, PTI government, push economy into stagflations, which is stagnant recently in the vicious circle of low economic growth, high inflation, and high unemployment. And thirdly, this recent phenomena that to proceed the IMF beloved package, IMF have put it harsh conditions. All these 3 scenarios and these circumstances, I think, shrink fiscal gap. So how we can cope with these challenges with fiscal stimulus and fiscal policy? I have some suggestions. I endorse Sajid Amin that we have to make further priorities because we have very shrink and we have very limited space, fiscal space. I also endorse Dr. Waqar comments that lower tier government, local, district and provincial government should be involved, must be involved. And third, I think we have to run parallel options to cope with these challenges. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Any more questions? Yes, Nadeem Saab, please.
Thank you very much. Excellent presentation by Zhang and elaboration of current way forward by Dr. Waqar. My question is regarding the recommendation being given by the Dr. Sajid Amin. How do you see that this study has bring new things on the table, especially the policy table? Because whatever recommendation that you have proposed is already been new by most of the researchers and the policy makers in Pakistan. And when you look into the macroeconomic architecture, structural things in Pakistan, it remains the same for years. So I would like to know what is new that is coming out from this report, especially after COVID. And my second inquiry and second question regarding the removal of subsidies. When you look into this, the combination or the division of subsidies in Pakistan is mainly going into the to the pro-poor smoothing of their consumption. So, and you can see that manifested in the current electricity bills that is being proponent of the large-scale agitation across the country. So, how do you see that the gradual removal of subsidies for the country, especially developing country like Pakistan, would be the beneficial in terms of providing the macroeconomic stimulus that you have proposed? Thank you.
Thank you. One more question, and then we can move. Any comment or question? Yes, we have. Is your name, please?
Okay, my name is Marri, and I am a consultant for All Points Relocation Company. My last degree was in disaster and emergency management, and this is just a comment. I think it's too late to suggest my opinion to be make a part of the policy, because the report has already been published. But in disaster management, what I learned was that mitigation and preparation are most important. But in Pakistan, we directly jump to relief and recovery. Floods do not come as a surprise in our country. It happens, it comes every year. But we tend to make the habitat in the same areas which were devastated the last year. So in order to, we can avoid lots of catastrophes and devastation, especially in the backdrop of the situation that we have limited resources and fundings. These can be avoided, and but unfortunately, we don't think on those lines, and we continue to repeat the same mistakes again and again, and we just jump on relief and recovery. So if we can, reevaluate that and build habitats in the areas which are far from, the banks of the rivers, or there's so many things that we can do, build perhaps dams and all that. In that way, we can, conserve lots of our resources and use them at a proper place. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Actually, we really believe that no opinion is a late opinion. This is an evolving discussion, and we really appreciate your feedback and ensure that we will be taking up in our discussions where we are. For example, SDPI is working on a resilient social protection system and other systems. So wherever this is applicable, we will be. Another team of us is working on exactly on the issues that you have been mentioning. And my colleague Kashif is here, and I'm sure he will also be noting. So we really appreciate it. It's not late, actually, it's very timely always, if your opinion is coming. So let me invite Zhang. If he has a response, then I'll be taking up. Over to you, Zhang.
Yeah, thank you, Sajid. So maybe let me first respond to the first question regarding like the physical challenge. It's very correct that you pointed out that the stagflation is now a threat to Pakistan and also to many other developing countries of Asia and Pacific, including some of the advanced countries. So this is a reality we mentioned in the 2021 survey macroeconomic analysis, and we also highlighted again in the 2022 survey. And how to deal with that? I think the reality is that there may be no silver bullet that can easily get a country out of the trap. But there are several ways that we can explore. The first is that from domestically, the resource mobilization is always like a first kind of policy advice on this kind of issue. So mobilize additional revenue to expand the physical space. However, this is we know that it's easier said than done. But in Asia and Pacific, there are some cases, especially in Southeast Asia, like in Myanmar, in Cambodia, in Laos, they have managed to increase their tax to GDP ratios by 3 to 5% of GDP, like percentage points, within a relatively short time frame. However, of course, they start with a much lower starting point. So their previous tax to GDP ratio is below 10%. So I believe Pakistan is doing better in terms of that. So it's like with a higher starting point, it will be harder to increase the tax to GDP ratio substantially within a short time period. But I don't think it's not doable. If there's political determination and there is a corresponding improvement on the spending side to make sure that the money is used efficiently and effectively, I think there's still space for revenue mobilization. And the second is to, of course, to make the expenditure side more efficient, better targeted, reallocate reprioritize the spending so that it has the biggest development impact compared to the status quo. And also, so non-tax revenues or some more innovative tax like revenue vehicles can be also considered by countries. Like for example, at the local level, the real estate market and the property tax is a big revenue source in the advanced world. So it contributes around 2% of GDP in tax revenue in Europe or in the United States. But in Asia and Pacific, the property tax is really not big. So it has potentials there, especially for fast developing economies with a booming real estate market. How to generate some revenues from the real estate boom, which is actually driven by public investment in infrastructure, public service, so on and so forth, should be a consideration for Asia-Pacific countries. So there are two techniques. Like in some places, if the land is owned by the public sector, like for example in China, which is the case, then it's easy because governments monopolize the sales of land, so it can charge a price on the usage of the land, and it generates a huge revenue for development. In China's case, it generates about 5 to 8% of GDP every year from the land lease program, which is about the same size of the infrastructure investment of China as a whole. But for other countries, like in the context that government does not hold a huge part of the land, then some other techniques can be used. For example, there can be betterment charges. So that is like, for example, governments investing in infrastructure improvement in a certain district, and after that they can charge or that put some of the cost on the residents there who enjoys the benefit of increased value of real estate in that district due to the improvement in infrastructure. So that can recover part of the infrastructure investment cost. Another way to do it is called the sales of building rights or development rights. So that's to say that if the real estate or landowner wants to develop on a piece of land, build taller buildings or change the use of land, for example, government can charge a fee for that depending on the value of the land and also the usage. So that can also recover part of the infrastructure investment cost, especially in urban areas, and mobilize additional revenue for the government. Of course, there is also an option for borrowing more. The next survey, so this upcoming survey, 2023 survey, we will be exploring this issue of debt sustainability issue and whether there is additional space for additional borrowing and the sustainable development spending. So Hamza may touch upon this a little bit more in his closing remarks. So these are the domestic policies. Of course, external, you can seek closer collaboration with different donors and development partners, so on and so forth. I also would like to touch upon a little bit on the last comment on this disaster management. I think it's a very valid point that like prevention and preparation cost money, but it also saves money by preventing or reducing the risks of damages, right, and the cost of damages to the economy, and also reduce the cost of the drain on fiscal space through this that relief and recovery effort afterwards. So this is again something we probably will touch upon in our next survey, because in that we'll be talking about the contingent liabilities for the public sector, for physical space, and the disaster relief could be one important part of it. So how to better like optimize the spending scheme so that to really minimize the necessity to spend additional money on disaster relief. I think that would be a very interesting point to explore. So hopefully we can touch upon that. And as Sajid has already said, that no opinion is a late opinion, and it can be reflected somewhere, hopefully. Thank you.
Thank you, Zhang. Before I move to Ali, I mean, very sort of important perspective that came from Nadeem Saab. You know, I always said and believe that no challenge is a new challenge for Pakistan. It is already existing, and no solutions are new solutions for Pakistan. But having said this, you know, the value of work that is sort of in a context, that what is the context in which this work has been taken, that actually defines the value of the work. In the work that we have been doing and the UNESCAP has been doing, I think I can add at least a couple of values I can sort of highlight which it added. We have a more informed understanding of how to respond to crisis. And this is not the last crisis that we are having. There can be many to come. And I think the analysis that we have put in, for example, the papers that are with you, the model that we have developed, I mean, the UNESCAP has developed, and we have tailored it for Pakistan, clearly shows where is the most effective and efficient investment. Is it in the people? Is it in the liquidity support to SMEs? Where it is. For example, we show it in our paper, for example, that if there was no fiscal stimulus, the Pakistan had lost a GDP of -3.6 instead of -4. And then it also gives you some scenarios that where you put your investment, given a limited investment, limited resources on your hand, which can create more equitable long-term impacts. So that is the one value that is the added by this work, that at least it generated an evidence-based debate that definitely is not the sort of, you can say, a very all in all that it gives you perfect solutions, but at least it starts an informed debate on this one. Similarly, as also highlighted by Zhang as well, I think this work, UNESCAP and the kind of we have been doing, first time, maybe it was there also, but with the greater clarity brings how monetary policy affects day-to-day life of a public at large. Other than inflation, I mean, the policies to control inflation has inequitable impacts. The social footprint of monetary policy, the inclusive central banking that is on board. So this is, I think, the kind of, we have broadened the agenda of development agenda of any country and how to achieve that development agenda of country. So far, largely, monetary policy has been sort of divorced from the broader public policy development agenda of the country. So we are trying to bring in that debate, and that I think is the second contribution, though at a very initial, very infant stage, but at least there is some word on it. And thirdly, I think, where of course, again, the margin of improvement remains there, is the tools that have been developed during this work. The one is the Excel sheet-based model that was developed by UNESCAP. The one is the macro model that at least, even if it can contribute 1% to informed decisions, that definitely is a contribution. Now, we don't claim that this is only we are making, but the overall discussion around the COVID. So if we club all these together, I think this work and the debate that you are generating as well. I mean, when I say this work, you are the partner of all this work, SDGs, government, and all of you sitting on the other side of the table, that it contributes to our understanding how to respond to crisis in a way that it minimizes its adverse impacts, particularly on the vulnerables, and what can be the effective and more efficient ways to recover from those COVID like crisis, any other crisis. So I think these are some of minor we think we were able to at least generate a debate on. So now let me go to Ali Kemal Saab before I invite Dr. Hamza Ali Malik. I'm just told that our chief guest for this session, Professor Hassan Iqbal Saab, will be joining us at around 1 p.m. He was supposed to join 12:30, but most probably he's got stuck somewhere. Will be joining us around 1 p.m. So over to you, Ali.
Thank you, Syed Saab. And as Nadeem Saab said, that these are all the old statements, and I'm just reading the tweet with Dr. Abid Suleri said in the morning. Countries that don't invest in human development are at losing edge. We all know that. By investing in education, health, and social protection, countries can build resilient communities that are very important. We all know that. But we have been saying this since 1960. So it's 40 plus 22, 62 years. Vision 2025 was in 2014, and it says people first. And it's been 8 years. We have been saying and saying and saying and saying and saying, and that's it. The ultimate thing is implementation, and we have net primary enrollment rate at 67, 2015. Right now it's 67. Literacy rate at 60, still at 60. So that's a dilemma, because we are saying that these are all the important things, but still we are at loss because we are not investing, or we are investing and there is the service delivery or a governance concern. Ma'am, up, Ajit. So Dr. Shabnam Safar's member social sector at the Planning Commission is joining us. The important thing about the model is that where do you need the investment? That's one of the important things. How much investment is required? That's another important thing. What will be the impact of that investment? That's another important thing. And the last thing, which is not covered totally, but partially, that how do we mobilize those resources, whether they are the public resources or the private resources. And I think before I say, I'll say two components, and I'll ask Dr. Shabnam to highlight on the public-private partnership we are doing at the Planning Commission, since she is here, so we can ask her. The role of monetary policy, which I have already said in the last session, this is very important for the inclusive growth. And one of the work which is being done at the PIDE, at different universities and SDPI, is about the financial inclusion, which is one of the most important thing, one of the most important component of inclusive development. If we have excluded some of the components of the society from these finances, whether it's coming to startup, whether they are coming into the working capital, we are not going to develop our startups. We are not going to develop the overall business sector where the gender is more representative, or where the startups are going up. So this is very important, that the monetary policy, whether it's a banking sector regulation, whether it's interest rate, whether it's a collateral or any other thing, where they can increase the financial inclusion for every society, every segment, every person who wants to invest and wants to start any startup. It is very important to have that. So I'll stop here. I'll ask Dr. Shabnam Safar to highlight about the public-private partnership at the Planning Commission. Thank you.
Gee, thank you so much, and my apologies, but we had some parallel meetings happening. So this is a very, very important dialogue. And we at the Planning Commission with COVID-19, and I look after the social sector. And we had an opportunity which the COVID-19 brought to us with the highlight on the importance of equitable access to health services, education, which was disrupted, and also the social protection element. And we invested in all three of them. And we had a close watch after that we had responded to the emergency on resilient recovery. Whereas we were able to repurpose our financing for COVID-19, and we were also able to build up our investment case, and we alone had one project which had 72 billion, which was given to health and to a couple of other sectors, despite the devolved mandates for health and education. However, we realized that without engaging the private sector, we would not be able to optimize the utilization and efficient and effective utilization of the available financing, which is with the government also. So the capacities were, and the institutional capacities that we had in place to utilize the 410% increase that we were able to bring in the health budgets alone was something which did not give us the sort of impact that we were looking for. So moving forward, what we really are focusing on is on the public-private partnership framework, both for health as well as for education. I'll be talking about from the social sector perspective because that's the domain I look after. And we are working on another very important project, which is on uplifting 20 poorest districts of the country, because that is where these are the ones which will give us the highest impact in terms of improving our indicators, because they are the ones who are actually lagging behind. And in our previous round, when we were giving out the financing, it was only to the public sector entities, where we realized that the absorptive capacity and utilization capacities were not as much as we were trying to increase the financing for that. But this time we are opening up to the private sector, to CSOs, NGOs, how they may help us in addressing some of the challenges which are there. So we are going to be having series of consultations with the development partners on some of the, in the morning we had one with the World Food Programme on what are some of the interventions that the government is able to scale up. And we are working closely with the Public-Private Partnership Authority, and in this year, we hope to have a public-private partnership framework for health and education in place to encourage partnership and to encourage optimization of the expertise and resources which are available for the private with the private sector for a win-win. It's if we are able to serve our marginalized communities in a much more effective and efficient manner, I think that's what the government's intention is. And for that, what are some of the things that the private sector feels that need to be put into place? What are some of the disincentives, or what could be some of the motivators for a healthy partnership with them? So that is something which is high on the cards, and we look forward to having such sessions and also some of the valuable feedbacks coming to us based on some of the successes as well as some of the partnerships with the private sector in the past which haven't worked. So what have been some of the bottlenecks so that we are able to address them as we move forward. So thank you so much, and we look forward to the deliberations of the day.
Yeah. Thank you, ma'am. And as Waqar Sahab has already mentioned, that provincial data is very important. And when we are talking about the SDGs, 76% of the indicators are with provinces. And when we are modeling about the SDGs and the stimulus package and other financing, then we need to have provincial data. And if we can estimate the same model on the provincial data, though we do not have some of the variables, some of the indicators at the provincial level, so we need to rely on some of the estimates, some of the estimations. But that is one of the important things which we need to model it with the coordination of national government, especially. But this is one of the important things which we need to do, and if we want to have a better estimates, because they are the ones after the 18th Amendment who are implementing at the provincial level. So, Saisab, if Hamza is not here, Dr. Hamza is not here, can we get some comments from the floor as well?
Yes, please. I think Hamza is rejoining us from another room actually, and has he joined?
I'm here.
Oh, yes. So, Hamza. no pressing question or comment, I can invite Dr. Hamza, but if there is, I can take one.
Yeah, let me know when you're ready.
No, you are, Dr. Hamza, we don't have any pressing comment from the audience. So you have sort of following this discussion. So over to you for your comments. Dr. Hamza is Director Macroeconomic Policy and Financing for Development Division, UNESCAP, Bangkok. But more importantly, he was the man behind all this work that we have been doing over the last couple of years and will be doing in the next couple of years. Over to you, Hamza.
Thank you, Sajid. Thank you very much. Very happy to be able to join all of you. I've been listening for the last 45 minutes. We have this major ministerial conference happening at the moment on catalyzing climate finance and financial flows for climate action. We had Honorable Minister for Pakistan, Shah Rahman, speak, and we just had, in the 10 minutes, Mr. Hamid Yaqub Sheikh. I'm supposed to be there at that session, running a bit behind here. So I'll be very brief over here, but I'm glad that I'm able to meet. Let me first start by thanking our colleagues once again, especially at the Federal SDG Unit, Ministry of Planning, Development and Special Initiative, Dr. Kemal in particular, and his colleagues, and our friends, colleagues at the Sustainable Development Policy Institute, like Sajid, I saw Akbar a few minutes ago, Abid Suleri. Thank you so much for your support in coordinating, cooperating with us to try to disseminate the findings and messages of this research. As you all know, this is about the annual flagship publication of UNESCAP Economic and Social Survey of Asia and the Pacific. Some of you may already know this is one of the oldest publications of its kind in the entire Asia-Pacific region, in print since 1947. Up until 1978, it had pretty much the monopoly of presenting a region-wide economic assessment. 78 onwards, IMF and World Bank, and later on ADB, started producing similar regional level economic assessment reports. And now there is a plethora of such reports produced by international organizations, think tanks, countries' own finance ministries, central banks, and so on and so forth. So it becomes very hard for policymakers to even set aside basic time to look at the executive summary to internalize the policy messages coming out from so much work going on, right? So we have been talking about changing our strategy a little bit in the last few years, and we have been reasonably successful. That is, rather than just publishing our research online and having what we call a major launch event, the way we used to do it with the media, disseminating, have a high fancy event, publish the chapters and other details on the webpage. We now engage to the best of our ability and given our resources with selected countries across Asia and the Pacific. The idea is to make it a two-way conversation, because I think Sajid was alluding to that. It's a continuum of idea exchange that happens. We engage with experts throughout the process of writing these reports. We get feedback, we incorporate them, we present our findings. And in the next round, when we engage at these policy dialogues, we discuss the policy messages and hear from the country level experiences. For us, this is extremely important. We can sit in our offices in Bangkok, look at the data and assess some broader policies and highlight and share some policy ideas. But when we engage with policymakers at the country level, we realize they know the ground realities far better. They know the context much better. They know their constraints much better, right? They are coordinating at the ground level among different policymakers to make those ideas a reality. Right, so our learning improves considerably in this engagement. So for that, essentially, I'm very, very grateful and thankful to all of you to set aside so much time today and discuss these things. I'm very grateful. I am afraid I might miss some of the names, but I was shared the very long and impressive list of speakers that have shared the floor before or shared their ideas. I was told that Honorable Minister Ms. Shazia Marri, Federal Minister for Poverty, Alleviation and Social Safety, BISP, Government of Pakistan, shared a recorded message earlier, though she is busy with the flood relief efforts. Then we had comments, of course, feedback from Ali and Sajid. We heard from Sayyid Zafar Ali Shah, Secretary, Ministry of Planning. We had special remarks by Ms. Mehnaz Akbar. I just heard Dr. Shabnam also joining, which I've heard her speak in many of the forums as well. We had comments from Naveed Akbar. the Director General Benazir Income Support Program, Dr. Asif from the Ministry of Planning Development, and Muhammad Ali Balpoor. My apologies, as I said, if I have missed somebody. So it's a very rich array of policymakers from different backgrounds sharing their experiences. I was also able to catch on some of the questions that were raised from the floor. I won't touch on all of them, but I'll highlight around 2 or 3 areas that I think are worth commenting upon. So what this particular issue of the survey, the 2022, is all about, we are focusing in on what we can call inclusive recovery and development. The context is simple. In 2021, we were, like all of you, preoccupied figuring out, understanding the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic and a range of economic policies that can and should be considered as a way forward, right? So we came up with this macroeconomic model that Sajid was referring to, which we have worked with Pakistan, coming up with what we called a Build Forward Better policy package. All the while, we were also highlighting risks and concerns regarding what we call, or many commentators call, a K-shaped recovery. Risks of existing vulnerabilities and inequalities widening in the context of COVID pandemic. And those risks have sort of realized when by the time we were publishing this issue, 2022 issue, back in March and April. So we were very cognizant of this widening gap on multiple fronts, elements of inequality from multiple angles, and then what to do about it. At the end of the day, we are primarily macroeconomists, and we look at the financing issues. So we wanted to revisit some of the mainstream macroeconomic policy approaches to shed light on this context. The other thing, which is extremely important for Pakistan, second main concern, was this debate around fiscal space or likely fiscal consolidation, rising debt concerns. If you read the global commentary, global reports were essentially saying it's good that a lot of countries have come up with very aggressive policy responses, especially on the fiscal front. As a result, deficits went up in 2021. Debt levels rose considerably, which was understandable. However, institutions in particular, like IMF, started raising these fiscal consolidation debates. It's an old school, typical IMF approach that they expect countries to sort of rein in the expansionary fiscal measures that they put in place. Because rightly so, in some countries, it leads to serious debt sustainability concerns. So we were very cognizant of, and somebody commented on that as well, that a lot of these policies are known, but you need resources to implement some of these policies. But in the same vein, if you're looking at likely fiscal consolidation or limited fiscal space, how do you implement some of these policies? So these two concerns, focus on inequality and fiscal space, was the main context in which we assessed this assessment, this analysis, and I'm sure my very capable colleague Zeng has shared a lot of details and ways we have done. So we look at 3 essentially areas: digging deeper into the fiscal space and essentially highlighting priority areas. They look obvious: invest in social protection, invest in healthcare, invest in education, but there's a huge amount of research behind that. Why these 3 areas? In the last year's research, we looked at the data across Asia-Pacific since 1960 and tried to come up with what are the areas that lead to more resilient economies. Countries focus on growing more, but they forget sometimes how to protect their already development gains that they've had, right? So what are the lessons we distilled from the last 50, 60 years of looking at effective policy measures that lead to resilient economies that are people-centric, but essentially these 3 areas. So it looked pretty obvious point, but it's worth reiterating again and again because it is not happening. It is not happening. Investments are not taking place in these areas across Asia-Pacific, and Pakistan, no exception. More needs to be done, right? So that's what you heard, what we call smart spending as a one summary catchphrase policy recommendation alongside taxpayer part. The second part, which to me, was having a background in central banking and monetary policy, was a little bit path-breaking kind of research ideas which we have put forward, inclusive central banking. Some are known and some are not that known, and a lot of them have not been implemented or being considered by central banks. And we are initiating this conversation with many countries in Asia and the Pacific, and I'm in touch with Sajid in particular. In SDPI, we intend to engage further to complement his and SDPI's ongoing research on social footprint of monetary policy in Pakistan. Both of us are in touch with Central Bank of Pakistan. Hopefully, we'll try and bring in these elements of inclusive central banking in the mainstream policy making. which Pakistan has not been the case. You talk about inflation and growth trade-offs whenever you hear about central monetary policy in the mainstream policy circles and media. Very rarely you actually hear, oh, what is the impact of this particular monetary policy on distribution of income in the country, or the way around, how the prevalent income distribution is affecting or is being incorporated in the monetary policy decision making. It is not being done in Pakistan and in many other countries. And what we are saying is there's a lot of value to it. The countries are doing that. The third part of our policy package was around structural transformation. Zeng, of course, was the lead author actually of that work himself. I'm sure he must have elaborated in detail. So we try to tackle these issues from multiple angles. Going forward, there are a couple of comments, and I'll be very brief because I have to rush through. Sajid also mentioned, and then Zhang also alluded to next year's or ongoing work. One particular area, and I'll probably be visiting Pakistan in September and maybe again in December, and I would love to talk in detail with Planning Ministry and Finance Ministry colleagues how to take this work forward, especially the financing side of some of these areas. There is a framework in UN which we are working with countries called INFF, Integrated National Financing Frameworks for the implementation of SDGs. We are trying to work with the government of Pakistan and several other countries across the globe how to apply that kind of framework in specifics. It depends on the priorities of different countries. In particular, just to give you a small teaser, a couple of areas where we are quite actively working are development of green bonds framework, or more interestingly, debt for climate swaps. The latter one in particular to me has a lot of relevance for Pakistan. It is facing debt issues, it needs resources, it is talking a lot more ambitiously about climate action and so on and so forth. There's a lot of value to explore debt for climate swaps, and we can work further. We've just begun working with Sri Lanka actually on these issues in the context of their current difficult economic conditions. We're working with Cambodia, we have begun working in Mongolia and several other countries. So this is something I can talk more in detail when I visit Pakistan, but just to give you an idea that some of the financing aspects we can cover on as a continuation of our partnership in Pakistan with SDG, Federal SDG Unit and the Ministry of Planning and with SDPI. The second one is a little bit hint, you can say, what Zeng was saying. Our next year research focus is around revisiting how debt sustainability is done. We have a lot of reservations with the typical DSA that IMF and World Bank produces, which is then used by international rating agencies to put a flag on countries. Oh, your outlook is now from stable to negative, and suddenly the interest rates go up in secondary market. These kind of considerations have a huge impact. IMF considers some countries' debt to be vulnerable, highly vulnerable. How do you know that? How do we come up with these rankings of this is highly vulnerable, this is medium vulnerable, this is low vulnerable? There is no theoretical underpinning for that. They're just traditions in a nutshell, right? Number two, they are primarily focused on economic uplift, not a more wider holistic well-being of society as a whole. That is why there's still so much anger in Pakistan, so much misunderstanding actually, and anger whenever Pakistan engages with IMF, because they think they are coming at the harm of the country at the cost of welfare of the people of Pakistan, which may not be the case. But the only issue is they're only looking at a very limited angle to try and promote certain aspect of it. They're saying a lot of right things, but we as Pakistanis, of course, and researchers in policymakers in Pakistan want something more than that, and they struggle finding a right balance between what needs to be done, especially under the IMF program, and what they would like to do without those kind of constraints. So we want to revisit DSA, debt sustainability analysis. We're calling it augmented debt sustainability analysis. We're going to try and propose a little bit of alternative. Once we want to keep in view the overall sustainable development agenda, how should you or a country or policymaker assess its debt situation? The context again is extremely simple. We all know that the investment needs to meet SDGs are enormous. Countries don't have the financial resources to meet them. There will be a need to step up efforts by government in terms of channeling more and more resources for SDGs pursuit. Where are the resources? They don't have. They probably have to issue more debt in the process, which is not necessarily a bad thing as long as it is achieving your development objectives. These considerations, this is one example of a consideration that is not incorporated in DSA. Similarly, what about climate risks? They are not part of a DSA at all. And Pakistan is facing, as we just spoke about, Pakistan is facing floods, severe floods, partly because of the climate change that is happening. I was reading some newspaper, I was shocked. In some parts of Sindh, the temperature hit 53 degrees Celsius. Ms. Sherry Rahman made an extremely powerful case in the morning, linking the recent floods with the ongoing climate change. And Pakistan is not contributing much, but facing the disasters. How is all that linked with the debt assessment, or broadly speaking, the fiscal constraints? These are the kind of questions I will tease you with for now. We will be researching between now and until next March. We will be engaging with the policymakers across, and a lot of experts and think tanks across the Asia-Pacific region in the process, some of you included. Maybe in November, we probably have an expert dialogue to get feedback and ideas. So we look forward to our engagement. So once again, before I conclude, let me thank again SDG unit, our friend Ali Kemal and his team, and SDPI and our friend Sajid in co-hosting us, setting aside some time, so much time, getting a lot of policymakers to get a conversation, dialogue going in trying to get the narrative clear and internalize that unless and until economic performance does not deliver welfare of the people, people are not going to be happy, they are going to be concerned. This is the essence of inclusive recovery and development, and this is what we call build forward fairer. So with these remarks, I stop here. Thank you very much once again. And I look forward to Minister Hassan's remarks, but I may have to leave in about 5 minutes or so. Thank you, Sajid. Thank you, Ali. And many thanks, Zeng, once again, for raising our flag in Pakistan.
Thank you. If you have to leave in 5 minutes, we fear that you may leave without listening. Professor, we are told that he has been called at NDMA, while they are still confirming that he will be joining, but there is meeting. But we make sure that we will be, if he doesn't reach to us, we will be reaching to him. Maybe. But in the meantime, I asked to take 2 to 3 comments. The one is a request from Rubina Zulkarnain Saiba. She is project manager, Federal SDGs unit. I'm requested to take special comment. Please. On the ongoing discussion, any comment?
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here to be part of this discussion, and this is very important and very encouraging to see that we have started policy dialogues. There have been many reports, as you have highlighted, that UNESCAP and other partners are actually producing, and we have multiple data and research with us now to integrate into policy and into programming, inclusive programming. But this dialogue is very important. I'm happy to listen to the comment by one of our colleagues that it is very important to have such dialogues at the provincial level. And it is also very important to have such dialogues and with the development partners and all the stakeholders. So to bring a different perspective, an inclusive perspective in inclusive policy development. So I think we would continue this debate and these policy dialogues at different levels. And I'm happy to be part of that as a manager of Federal SDG unit. And I'm really thankful to UNESCAP, SDPI, and Planning Ministry that they are really conscious about reprioritization and spending on the priority sectors, including health, education, and especially the social protection. Thank you.
Thank you, Rubina Saba. We really know that we came a surprise to you, but the man behind this surprise is the Ali Kemal. Actually, he gave me that I should reach to you. So to sort of avoid another surprise, that is Razik Shanwari, I'll come to you. But before that, let me just to give you space to not to get surprised, to Zeng for his comment.
Yeah, thank you, Sajid. So I just want to pick up the first couple of comments from Dr. Talpa. I think which is quite valid, for the overall research in ASCAP. So the first thing he mentioned is that 60 to 70% of the policies discussed today will actually happen at the subnational level. So this is something like I have been attracting our attention, but at the same time also challenging us, because ASCAP typically operates at the regional level. So we, of course, like discuss national policy at the country level, but we rarely go further to the subnational levels. And that's sort of complemented by colleagues like from UNDP who really works on the ground, on the front lines. But we do realize that many of the policies are actually implemented, especially social policies are actually implemented by the local governments, which typically accounts for maybe 60 to 70% of the overall public expenditure, right? At the same time, that the resource mobilization aspect of at the subnational level, the public finance at the subnational level is rarely discussed at the international scene. And which we have actually taken some interest in this and worked on a little bit on the taxation in municipalities. So that's how big cities mobilize resources for urban infrastructure investment, urban public service, so on and so forth. And we did 2 workshops back in 2017 and 18. There was good response from the policymakers participating in that. But we somehow discontinued because of this contradiction with the regional representation of ASCAP. So I think that's a very valid point. I think it's worth ASCAP at least inspires us to study further, the Sajid also mentioned to me yesterday. He's thinking that one of the comparative weakness of ASCAP is that it is in the follow-up side. So we make policy recommendations that how actually to push forward for this policy recommendation to be actually designed in reality and implemented on the ground. I think that's something we need to work further. And to do that, we probably need to take into subnational issues into account. I think the second, the comments from Dr. Chapa was the private sector development and also the remittance inflows and also the scalability of startups. I want to take particular on this the role of the diaspora in terms of development and creation and job creation and also the startups. I think these two are quite linked. I just give the example again. I'm Chinese, so I give the example of China. That back in the early stage of China's economic development, back in the 80s and 90s, the biggest foreign, so-called foreign investor is not United States, nor the European Union, but Hong Kong and the Taiwan province of China. So why? Because of course the cultural similarity, the same language, and then so a lot of investment are actually coming from this sort of Chinese diasporas from outside, right? From Hong Kong, from Taiwan, and a little bit also from Singapore. And they brought in a lot of investment and more importantly, as pointed out by Dr. Tampa, the knowledge and the know-how. So that's how the Chinese economy really took off. And they also help us to connect the Chinese economy to the international market so that the trade was kick-started. And what the Chinese government did, I think relatively successfully, was to really create a conducive business environment for these startups. But this business environment could be slightly different from the business environment in the concept of our peer organizations such as the World Bank, because it's not specifically answering on giving the investors a free market to operate in, but rather to really look into case by case and give incentives for local government officials to work closely with these investors to solve their problems, to the extent that the local government can provide the dormitory for the workers, temporary, provide the land and coordinate the utility supplies for the investors, and sometimes even help in the recruitment process to bring in the correct talent and labor force for the investors. So that's the extent that the governments like take the responsibility and go really a long way to help the startups and help diaspora investors into the country, really help the economy to grow. And also, like through the process, it cultivates a conducive environment for business operations. So I just want to throw in this 2 cents in response to Dr. Zafar's wonderful comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Zhang. We have been just confirmed that Minister will not be able to arrive. Actually, he has been called in an urgent meeting at NDMA, so regarding flood relief. So let's move towards conclusion. One comment from Shinwari Sahib, and then Waqar Sahib, I'll be coming you for your vote of thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Saab. I'm Razik Shinwari, Economic Policy Advisor with the Federal SDG Unit. Just two minor comments. The first one is sometimes the ambitious economic agenda leads to political aspersions for the current governments. So two dimensions which I think we should consider before we talk about any economic recovery plan. One is the sectoral trade-offs, and the second one is, of course, the political economy. From the financing point of view, there is no denying the fact that resource mobilization is one of the important aspects, but the government has to do it in a non-inflationary way. For example, in the recent response to the COVID, State Bank provided around 5% of GDP support to the real sector in Pakistan. But what happened, the commentators usually highlighted it resulted in overheating of the economy and thus caused inflation in the country, which created other macroeconomic vulnerabilities. So we have to consider that as well. The trade-off between the sectorals, once we really want to have an effective response to the COVID-like pandemics and other disasters in the country, but we have to consider the trade-offs and the demand side, we would call it constraints, into the consideration before we move on that. Second important thing is the political consideration. Sometimes we may have an ambitious economic recovery agenda, but may not be on the cards of the political government. So we have to consider this, because sometimes it will bounce back in a very, you would call it the political aspersions for the current government. So the macroeconomic vulnerabilities, the sectoral trade-offs, and of course the resource mobilization in the non-inflationary manner would be some of the crux of the today policy dialogue. Thank you.
Razik Saab, thank you for very insightful comments. This brings me to the last vote of thanks. And after the vote of thanks, you will be joining us on Zamana restaurant for the lunch. Thank you so much. Over to you, Waqar Saab, for vote of thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Very briefly, on behalf of SDPI, let me thank our partners, Ministry of Planning, Development, Special Initiatives. Really grateful to Madam Member Social Sector who could join us for this meeting. And of course, Ali Saab and his team has been around since morning, and of course in the background as well. So thank you to him as well. Mr. Hamza Ali Malik, who joined us from Bangkok, and of course Zhang, who was able to make it from Bangkok and come all the way. So thank you to both and their teams who were there in the background. I was very encouraged to see the interest of our honorable parliamentarians today, including Madam Shazia Marri Sahiba and Madam Mehnaz Akbar Aziz Sahiba, who were with us and of course enlightened us on not only their thoughts on this subject, but also the way forward. I also want to thank the development partners who were able to attend this meeting today. I can see the IMF and I can see JICA and other colleagues as well who have been able to attend today's meeting. Last but not the least, I also want to thank Dr. Sajid Amin, Dr. Abid Suleri, our Executive Director, and of course the teams who were able to bring all of us here for this deep dive into this subject, which is extremely timely and policy relevant. I've already spoken my part of the way forward earlier, but I would really urge all the participants and our partners who are watching us online to keep following the web page dedicated for this subject at SDPI's website. as well as the Sustainable Development Television's website, where we will continue to cover this subject further. Now, our efforts as knowledge brokers in the space doesn't end over here, and we will be convening once again to discuss the same subject and recap it at the annual Sustainable Development Conference, which again is being hosted in collaboration with Ministry of Planning, Development and Special Initiatives. With this, I leave you to Dr. Sajid and his team to escort you to the lunch, and let's continue this very productive discussion over lunch as well. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.